So I've recently been replaying 2012's Hitman Absolution and 2016's Hitman, and I am genuinely kicking myself for forgetting that these games exist back when I made my Killing Eve video, because of all of the video games and series that I could have brought up as prime examples of well-written, humanised villains or anti-heroes who are also fun to play as, the fact that I totally forgot that Agent 47 is a thing is practically unforgivable, and you should probably sharpen your metaphorical pitchforks and light your torches. You know, normal stuff. So I thought, sod it, let's talk about it. Let's talk about villainy in video games, Hitman, and Agent 47. The recent advent of Hitman 2 But Not Really proves that there's still life in a series that began in a humble little Danish studio way back in 2000. Jesus, I didn't realise this series was that old. And certainly still life in a company who were relatively recently kicked to the curb, very unceremoniously, by Square Enix. I'm glad that IO Interactive managed to gain their independence and retain the rights to their most famous franchise, and the reason for this is pretty simple. How many other game series marry their sharp, satisfying, and occasionally goofy gameplay with dark and serious undertones, and themes exploring civil unrest, biological warfare, human experimentation, cloning, and the nature of one's existence? Not many, that's for sure. In all honesty, the fact that the Hitman series has a handful of wonderfully daft segments and possibilities sprinkled throughout it, from killer clowns to flying briefcases, is possibly one of the reasons why it has endured, despite the less than extraordinary sales figures and publisher mismanagement. I mentioned in my last video on the subject that part of the reason why we so rarely play honest-to-God bona fide villains is perhaps due to the disconnect of a majority moral, upstanding society taking on the role of an unthinking, unfeeling murderer. But Hitman's willingness to divulge in the creative and the crazy goes some way towards alleviating this moral dissonance. And in its own unique way, it makes mastering the art of the silent assassination not just gratifying, but fun. I've already discussed the problems of both creating a believable psychopath and playing a game entirely based on one, so I will try not to repeat myself too much, but I feel it's worth discussing the extent to which I believe Agent 47 is actually a psychopath in the first place. Sure, boiled down to his barest roots, he is basically the most avatar-y of all the player avatars to ever exist, but that's not to say that 47 has no personality at all. In fact, as the series went on, it began to introduce more and more personal stakes and motivations that ensured 47 was more fleshed out than just being a bull bloke who is literally anyone and everyone. Aside from his silky smooth audiobook narrator voice, 47's skills, capabilities and impeccable dress sense are not just designed to assist the player in playing their way, but to assert 47's cool, composed confidence in his abilities. His sleek, simple design marks him as an ordinary-looking man with tremendous prowess in the art of assassination. I mean, ignoring the pretty glaring barcode stamped on the back of his head. Design-wise, it's memorable and distinctive, but I mean, really, couldn't the scientists have put it somewhere less obvious? Like, on the sole of his foot or something? Regardless, the reason I want to take a moment to call into question Agent 47's moral fibre is less to do with trying to discredit the fact that 47 is an anti-hero, because he most definitely is, and more to do with whether or not he's actually a psychopath or a sociopath. In truth, I find this conversation fascinating because, as we discussed last time, there's a degree to which psychopathy and the actions of those afflicted is, in its own macabre way, compelling. We yearn to understand how and why these individuals act the way that they do, whether they truly are utterly emotionless or if it is something vastly more complex than just an outright dismissal of their humanity. At a peripheral glance, Agent 47 is a cold, emotionless man who murders because he is good at it, and has found a way to make a living out of killing. But strip back the layers and ignore the player's decisions for a moment, and you find that Agent 47 is, in fact, much more than the sum of his talents. The second game begins with 47 living on the grounds of an Italian church, having abandoned the life of an assassin, but when two cheery thugs bust in and kidnap the parish priest, he readily returns to the life he had abandoned, all in order to find out who is responsible and to rescue the priest. If 47 were truly an emotionless psychopath, this game wouldn't exist in the first place. 47 would have shrugged and sighed and carried on with his life. These insights into his thought processes are infrequent but absolutely interesting every time they happen, uncovering the complex machinations that compel him to pursue this lifestyle. Hell, in Absolution, 47 gives up his prized twin baller pistols all in order to get information to help protect Victoria, a young girl whom Diana liberated from the clutches of the ICA, their mutual employer, to prevent her from being twisted into an assassin the same way that he was. At the point in the game at which you can reclaim the guns, there are multiple ways to do so, but the most rewarding way is to agree to and win a gunslinger contest, rewarding you with a cutscene that has the barest emotional twang but feels tremendously in character with 47's established personality. Plus it looks super cool. 47 may be a stony-faced son of a gun, but goddamn does he love those pistols. What makes Hitman stand out as a series though, aside from its humourless protagonist, is its dedication to the art of the assassination. Every game in the series is littered with methods of disposal, from the tools in your hand to the environment itself. Opportunity for infiltration and assassination presents itself around practically every corner, although the game will never force you down any one of these paths. No matter how impossible the situation seems, you can always find a way through without a disguise, and acquire that sweet, sweet achievement for completing a mission without ever changing out of your signature suit. You could poison the food whilst dressed as a chef, dress as a bodyguard and pop a bullet in your target's cranium, dirty the target's cocaine so that when he takes a sniff he drops dead and petrifies his dealer, and if you really want to, you can just rush in and slaughter everyone. This is where the discussion on morality usually comes up in anti-violent gaming propaganda. It's worth noting the fact that the Hitman games actively punish excessively violent and/or obnoxious behaviour by way of alerts, alarms, hikes in difficulty, and score decreases. This is less about moral equations though, and more about encouraging the player to experiment, trying out different weapons and different methods of murder until they master a level, with the elusive silent assassin rating marking the player as the perfect master akin to 47 himself. I have found that as the games have gone on, achieving this rating does feel much easier, but it might also just be me getting better at the games. Given the way that some of Absolution's levels are constructed though, I'm just going to choose to believe that the latter is the case so that I can feel better about myself. Speaking of levels, something that has always felt consistent and elegant about the series is its stellar level design. Typically utilising large open environments to scout and navigate, the games have always made great use of a design ethos that encourages repeat playthroughs, and experimentation, even if it is just to find that one bizarre or obscure route to completion that rewards the quirky player's need to explore. There is something profoundly satisfying about finding the most ridiculous way to dispatch a target, all whilst making it look like an accident and achieving that silent assassin rating. Hitman makes assassination an art, but never at the cost of the player's sense of accomplishment and enjoyment. If you want to go mental, then by all means go mental. So, what is it about the Hitman series that differentiates it from, say, Manhunt? Both series require the murder of specific people to progress. The plot is driven by your psychopathic actions, and yet Manhunt 2 was banned in the UK until it was censored, where no Hitman game ever has been. Why? Well, here's what the BBFC said about Manhunt 2 upon rejecting classification. Rejecting a work is a very serious action and one which we do not take lightly. Where possible, we try to consider cuts, or in the case of games, modifications which remove the material which contravenes the board's publishing guidelines. In the case of Manhunt 2, this has not been possible. Manhunt 2 is distinguishable from recent high-end video games by its unremitting bleakness and callousness of tone, in an overall game context which encourages visceral killing with exceptionally little alleviation or distancing. Although the difference should not be exaggerated, the fact of the game's unrelenting focus on stalking and brutal slaying, and the sheer lack of alternative pleasures on offer, contribute towards differentiating this submission from the original Manhunt game. Manhunt was already at the very top end of what the board judged to be acceptable in that category. Manhunt 2's availability would be unacceptable to the public. I mentioned last time that the BBFC typically only refuses classification on the grounds of glorified excessive violence or something far more sinister, such as the portrayal of sexuality involving minors. Ignoring for a moment the fact that Hitman and Manhunt are vastly different genres with different end games in mind, it's the intent behind the violence that matters to the BBFC. to what extent the game provides levity, whether the context of the game and its story befits and justifies the content, and so on and so forth. Where Hitman is more focused on the here and now, the immediacy of dealing with your targets in as clean a way as possible, Manhunt is more about progressing from point to point, with the killing contextualised in the framing narrative of being an escaped asylum patient, who seems to have been experimented on by the government. Aside from the occasional deviations to, for example, find a box of drugs in your old house, the majority of the game will be spent murdering folk, with 3 hierarchies of execution depending on how long you hold down your murder things button. Still, whilst it's true that Manhunt 2 is relentlessly grim and dreary, it's neither the darkest nor the goriest thing I have ever come across, even back when it was released a decade ago. Maybe I would feel differently if I was able to get an uncensored copy of the game, but the fact remains that the unrated version is entirely unavailable in the UK, even as a digital download, so I will never know. Maybe I've just grown accustomed to violence in video games, or maybe it's the censorship of the final product, but I honestly don't see what all the fuss was about. Both Manhunt games are psychological horrors rooted in the context of a steady descent into insanity, not necessarily at the hands of the protagonists themselves. Government corruption, human experimentation, and a somewhat understated criticism of social glorification of violence in media. They are games where reality is questioned and the true horror comes from within. Maybe it's the fact that the games were published in 2004 and 2008 respectively, and they haven't necessarily aged very well. I acknowledge that at the time they must have seemed horrifyingly visceral, but it baffles me that considerably more violent games like Mad World, despite being cel-shaded and on the Wii of all consoles, or the hilariously, unapologetically anti-PC House of the Dead Overkill, were released without issue, including in Australia, which is interesting in and of itself, whilst Manhunt 2 was banned outright until it was censored. So by now you're probably wondering why on earth a video that is ostensibly about Hitman is just rambling on about the Manhunt franchise. The reason is that I want to draw comparisons between the way that violence and psychopathy are contextualised in 2 very different genres, and how that context is conveyed to the player. The levity in games like these is so important in presenting the player with an enjoyable area within which to exact their wanton destruction, even if it is the only bright spot in an otherwise excessively dark room. Manhunt 2 is shamelessly grim, where Hitman is instead flourishing with a life and passion that, whilst tonally opposed to its subject matter, it nonetheless makes the art of the kill a fascinating achievement for the player to strive towards. At the end of the day though, these series are trying to achieve totally different things, and conflating them can only go so far as discussing the fact that both rely on killing to progress. That context for death that the BBFC so greatly desires could easily be the deciding factor in whether or not a game is beaten into an early grave, and the core reason why we don't tend to see many games where you are a villain, only a villain and nothing more. We need the complexity of an interesting character and a commentary on the world that they are within, plus the levity of stepping away from wanton destruction every so often, to be able to convince the rating boards and the mouthy conservatives that what we're putting out there for consumption is not just an MDK simulator, but a legitimate criticism of society, or something equally as philosophically presumptuous. Realistically, I'd put it forward that very few people play the Hitman games for the plot, just as very few people these days play StarCraft 2 for the unabashedly cliched and adorable relationship between Raynor and Kerrigan. There are certain games, or often certain genres entirely, where the plot is more of a background whisper than anything, requiring very little attention so as to focus the player on the grandeur and spectacle of the experience. Games like Burnout, Devil May Cry, Mortal Kombat. Whilst the lore of the latter 2 series' universes is undoubtedly interesting, a good chunk of players won't really care about it. They are there for the fun and freedom of slicing up demons and ripping out spines.
You don't fuck with a god.
Many of these types of games are very much about rewarding the player for their skill and enjoying the feeling of pulling off an immensely complex but rewarding move, defeating a difficult boss, or just generally mastering the game's mechanics. Now, I'm not saying that Hitman is fighting game levels of complex, even if it can be irritatingly intricate at times and upsets the perfectionist in me. I'd suggest that Agent 47 himself has more in common with a character like Dante and Bayonetta in terms of his personal agency complementing ours, than he does with Ryu or Sub-Zero. Whilst all 5 of these characters absolutely subscribe to the spectacle theatre their occasionally goofy games occur in, the fighting genre, for all its blocky beginnings, tends to have a much more serious streak going on in the background narrative. Even ignoring the fascinating voice acting in Devil May Cry, Hideki Kamiya's games have always revelled in the enjoyably ridiculous. That charm captured players' attention right from the off and kept them coming back for more over and over again. Having serious, gritty narratives is cool and all, but every so often you just want to play a game that treads the thin line between parody and silliness, and that charm is something that a game like Manhunt 2 is, perhaps somewhat rightly, missing. I'm not saying that grimdark games need to have constant moments of sunlight, but a little here and there don't go amiss. And they might have lessened the upset that games like Manhunt tend to cause. Perhaps that's why Hitman has persisted despite the company's issues and despite a less than stellar start for almost 2 decades. Players latched onto its charm and character, its protagonist's quiet blank disinterest, and his ability to remain professional even when dressed in the most absurd costumes imaginable. By refraining from drawing too much attention to its more playful aspects, the series has grown into a franchise that celebrates the ridiculous as much as it emphasises restraint. Despite not truly presenting an opportunity to delve into the role of a genuine villain, Hitman nonetheless stands as a testament to the ease with which one can contextualise committing terrible deeds without greatly alienating the player, indeed whilst also successfully prompting the player to explore and find new, more interesting ways to complete objectives without having to drive home the glorified nature of its violence. The freedom, creativity, and open-ended nature of the games prevents the player from feeling stifled by the criminality of their actions, and beholding a sense of power and professionalism that only grows as the player learns to master their abilities and their environment, and thus the efficiency of their kills. Whilst this does reinforce the point I made last time that games tend to prefer morally ambiguous characters rather than outright evil ones, it's easy to see from games like Manhunt 2 why developers stray from delving too deeply into that rabbit warren, and that shouldn't and doesn't diminish the achievements that the Hitman series and IO Interactive have perfected. Personally, I hope that IO stick around for a good while longer. They're damn good at the blank-faced assassin narrative, and though they're not necessarily entirely devoid of dirty corporate dealings, with the recent upset over Hitman 2's privacy policy proving unpopular on Steam, they are nonetheless one of the few developers who seem to take any pride in their work right now. And that pride and determination is the reason why a game like this instead became a game like this.
I think they called me 47.
That's not a name.
So make it one.
All right. Agent 47.
Thank you for watching. If you like what I do and you'd like to see more, please consider checking out some of my other videos. In fact, why not go see me rip on Shadow the Tomb Raider for 50 minutes like the bitchy fanboy that I am? Or if that doesn't tickle your fancy and this is your first time, please consider watching the first part of this series to see where this discussion all began. Major thanks to Matthew Marshman, Rigged for Epic, and a certain Wolf's Abyss Walker for the continuous support. These guys have been with me since pretty much the beginning and I can only express extreme gratitude for that. Thank you guys. Have a good one.